All right. So thanks for sticking around for the conversation with filmmaker Otto Buj, the director of Dope Hookers and Pavement, the real and imagined history of Detroit hardcore. As I said earlier in the intro, I'm Rob St. Mary, a local Detroit writer, as well as a board member here at Cinema Detroit. So to start off, congratulations again, Otto, on this. Doing a full feature, not a quick process. So kind of walk me through it. When did this whole thing kind of come together for you, and how long did it take?
But what happened was my mom passed away in 2015, March. As a bit of a sort of a, familial duty, I decided to start archiving a lot of our family history, photos, this and that, including a box of Super 8 films. I sent the box of Super 8 films out to get captured, digitized. And it was stuff I was very familiar with, growing up, traveling, this and that, Niagara Falls, overseas, Europe, playing baseball. And when I got the footage back from the transfer house, pretty much towards the end of it, I mean, second to last reel, up pops this footage of this punk show. This sort of like the scrum and the sort of excitement of a punk show. It was silent footage. It was not very well shot, low light. And I said, wow, I mean, where did this come from? I knew what it was because I'd actually been steeped in the 80s hardcore punk scene starting in 1985. And I had two older brothers who were involved earlier than that, 81, 82. Needless to say, I asked my brother, says, do you know anything about this? He says, oh, wow, I think I shot that like back, and I totally forgot about it. And 35 years later, this footage comes up of a show from the freezer in March 1982, sorry. He'd forgotten all about it. It turned up in his box. I knew just based upon my sort of, fairly specific, deep sort of knowledge of the Detroit punk scene, there's never any footage of the Freezer Theater, at least motion picture footage. I thought, wow, this is kind of special. So this is 2015, late summer of 2015. I decided to put it up on YouTube just to, get some feedback and get some clarity on what exactly we're seeing here, exactly in terms of who's who's on camera here, what show is this? And a number of people got back to me fairly quickly, said, filled in some of the details. And what I realized then is that with the people getting back in touch with me, there was this very active network of people who are still interconnected today, like 35 years later from that scene. It was very tribal in that way, and there's still like a lot of community there. And I decided, okay, maybe I'm going to start talking to people about this. And as I started talking to people, more people came forth, and the story started to get built. And the scope of it I wasn't aware of yet, and I had to just keep talking to people until I hit like almost 70 people. And I realized, wow, there's a lot of history here, and there's a lot of oral history and something that's the sort of history of Detroit underground culture, rock and roll culture, corridor culture that hasn't really ever been properly documented. So I said, okay, that's the task at hand, and here we are. It was a 2-year project really on that level, 2017 to early 2020.
One of the things, and I'll show my cards here in terms of my own family history, I have a lot of connections to Canada. My heritage comes from Canada and things like that. And that's one of the things that I really love about the documentary is that you were able to show this connection between both sides of the river, because I think in a lot of ways, those who were young enough to remember being able to go across the river quite easily in the pre-9/11 era, Windsor always felt like this connected space. It didn't feel as distant, I think, as it does now. And obviously now, we're dealing with the pandemic.
Yeah. At that point in time, I mean, Windsor, Ontario, literally from where you are is probably on a good traffic day over the bridge is a 8-minute drive. It's closer than Ferndale, in that respect. So the reason I say that is because Windsor's always had a sort of gravity towards Detroit culturally, athletic, professional sports, this and that, much more so than it has a connection to the remainder of Canada. I mean, Canada really, as far as we're concerned, doesn't start until you hit Chatham towards London and, up the road to Toronto. So we've always been a bit of an annex of Detroit culturally, the psyche and amongst, other things. And a lot of it has to do with spending a lot of our time being in Detroit. Like I say for myself, I was born in Toronto, grew up in Windsor, but I was raised in Detroit because that was a big formative part of my upbringing.
Yeah. And I love that whole section where you're able to show this history. I mean, were you aware that some of the first hardcore shows actually didn't take place in the corridor? They did take place like down the street from where you grew up?
I up until this film was the interviews were happening, the story was being put together. That was just the stuff of kind of like local folklore as far as punk rock folklore. Oh, this band played, there's like 30 people there, that band played. And then, okay, I thought, oh, wow, okay, I saw some flyers, and that was fascinating. But there's never really documented sort of eyewitness account of it. It was just sort of something someone would say, whether a bit of exaggeration or bluster. And I think what's interesting, I mean, obviously, at this point, I think people have seen the film, but how important Windsor was to the development of the Detroit hardcore punk scene, that might not be terribly important to most people in a very big picture, but it's a very important part, obviously, of Windsor's little sort of countercultural history. But it's also, if you want to consider the whole what happened out in the Cass Corridor in the purview of this film, in that little time window between 81 and 82, was that Windsor played a big part in a small chapter of Detroit rock and roll that I think is sort of something, certainly to be, I'm not much to use the word proud of anything, but much to have a bit of, let's recognize ourselves as being a part of that sort of the long and winding road to that, place in history, Detroit history.
And that's one of the things that that I love about it, and we'll get a little more into talking about the corridor in that, is that just to kind of reiterate just a bit, I mean, I think that there has been always this connection between both sides of the river. I mean, as a kid who grew up in the 90s, obviously listening to 89X, you can go back and talk to my parents. They were listening to the Big 8, CKLW. So, I mean, just a massive, just sort of this international place where really interesting things can happen. And
I think there's something, even though it's not within sort of my scope of interest, even something like with electronic music, we talk about, Derek May, Kevin Saunderson, but Richie Houghton, who's a very big part of that, is from Windsor. Yeah. He is so these communities have been interconnected, I think, in many scenes, many sort of cultures, subcultures and whatnot. And so in that respect, I think Windsor is very sort of pleased to be a part of Detroit. One of the sort of, extensions of Detroit.
Yeah. I mean, right now I'm actually sitting here at Cinema Detroit, and it's sad because I love movie theaters and I love the ability to come together. It's like, to me, I used to say as a kid that like going to a good movie is like going to church. There's this feeling of community and connection, and Cinema Detroit is here and has always been right here in the corridor. So let's talk a bit about the corridor, because I mean, it is a huge part of this documentary, and you touch on that history of why this place has been this kind of the place of artists and outsiders and those willing to take the risks.
Yeah, I think, I'm just going to speak through the eyewitness of others, because my involvement with the corridor did start, even when I was going to shows in the mid 80s, there was a lot less activity happening in the corridor at that point in time. It had spread out to like the Greystone out on Michigan Avenue, or up on Gratiot, places like Trax and this and that, or hall shows. But at the time, I think what it is that the corridor, I get the sense, was always a place, whether it was, I wouldn't necessarily say you would call it a place that was welcoming to sort of people who are willing to sort of endeavor to do outsider type art things or music things. It wasn't that it was welcoming. It was just that nobody was sort of watching, or nobody was telling you, you can't do this, or nobody was telling you you're too loud, or nobody was telling you, you can't pile 400 kids into a room that really technically only should fit 80 people, 80 kids. So nobody was there to officiate. Nobody was there to restrict, up until, of course, in the course of the film, when, the cops got sort of tipped off, hey, what's going on down there? It was nothing sort of, let's say, malignant. I mean, it wasn't a drug trade. There wasn't like sort of violence on the level of, being something that would concern neighbors, but it was just a matter of they were realizing, okay, these kids have too much freedom here. And at some point, even in a neighborhood, which the corridor, which at that point in time, where the Detroit hardcore scene was happening, was on the southern fringe of the Wayne State sort of, student ghetto, as it's been described, but also on the northern, least dangerous part of the corridor, which was at the same time never too far from the most dangerous part of the corridor. So it had to operate in this sort of margin of law or lawlessness, and of whatever you can get away with. So I think the corridor at that point in time was a place that was very permissive, by virtue of the fact that nobody was there to tell you to stop you.
And nobody was there to stop the Burger King from selling the burger thing. So
The burger thing, the burger things, yeah. And the corporate didn't bother with that little franchise on cast that sold the burger thing. You know, corporate office didn't. But yeah, it was just that environment. It was like an open book. Some people like an empty slate, and I think artists, I get the sense, took advantage of that earlier. In the film, we touch upon like the Freezer Theater was not invented or established by the hardcore kids in Detroit. No, they kind of moved in and took advantage of an environment that let them sort of do their thing. And but before the hardcore kids came along, the Freezer Theater, run by dramatic research company Detroit, and people like Ishmael Ahmed doing shows down there. It was a sort of a cultural sort of destination for people who were interested in doing things that were outside of the mainstream at that point in time. So there is a prehistory there to Detroit hardcore punk in the corridor.
One of the things I wanted to ask you about is that title. I know very few people who would put in their documentary title real and imagined history, because they're always striving to show this is the real history. See?
Yeah.
So explain that.
The title, the first part of the title kind of ties to the second part of the title. Dope Hookers and Pavement is actually a quote from within the film, of course, but it sort of points to there's a level of heightened, exaggeration, a bit of puffery, a bit of sort of, overstating the environment a little bit, and then maybe kind of looking at things in retrospect. Some people tend to do that, who with a little more flourish. I think that's the way, as far as some people are concerned, it was Escape from New York for them, like that environment, that post-apocalyptic environment. Some of these kids, but then some other people who are a little more sort of like sober-minded and a little less prone to imagination say, well, nah, it was bad, but not that bad. But the imagined part comes in because a lot of the film has to do with the whole sort of memory and sort of capturing sort of a consensus on what happened. And I find, as with this, it's hard to get total consensus. Some people some people sort of not depend. I would say some people sort of rely on a very sort of objective memory, and some people sort of opt or sort of resort to a heightened memory. And the heightened memory usually is the more fun one, the exciting one. And that's why Imagine comes in, because there's no truth to how it really was or what really happened. There's variations or versions of the truth. And I think we have a little bit of fun with that in the film, because the film is, as the scene is, lends itself to a lot of mythologizing, self-mythologizing. And I think, nobody's lying. I think people are just a little elastic with truth a bit. So,
yeah. One of the things I find interesting is, and it doesn't matter if it's, the ancient Greeks or if it's parents today, they're always like, these kids today, And the thing that kind of blows my mind, and granted, I don't have teenagers of my own, but I wonder, is there that passion to do something like this today? I mean, back then, they were 14, 15-year-old kids setting up a music scene in kind of a burned out or rundown area, and doing some interesting things. And today I wonder if everything we're just living like this now. We're just living online.
I think what it is, that's part of the one of the subtexts of the film, and I think it deals with it towards the last stretch, where you get Greg Lewis talking about how it's never going to happen again in the same way. And he does feel a little bad for kids today. And then somebody else says, well, it can happen, but it's going to happen on whatever terms the new kids are dealing with at this point in time. And then Ian Mackay says at the same time, neither of that happened. It's just that we set an example, and however you apply the example that we set. But I think what you're saying is, and it points to a bigger issue I didn't even address in the film, is that, okay, one thing that kids can't experience it the same way. Why? Because things are too easy now. Back then you built a scene, you found one another because nobody else was going to do it for you, provide it for you. So you built it. And it was something like a few of the people say in the film, Greg Boker, Rob Michaels, it involved a lot of hard work at that point in 1981 to find one another, to find out what was going on, to be a part of a, for lack of a better word, scene, or to be a part of a tribe that you had to make an effort, and you had to take a lot of risks and make a lot of sacrifices to be there and to be part of something. And by virtue of showing up, I'm talking about that very early scene, 81, when it was effectively 30 people, 30 kids, that slowly started growing, everybody there embraced one another because they understood that, okay, the path here was not easy. So let's just sort of enjoy the fact that we found each other. Now it's almost a few clicks away for almost anybody to be a part of anything, no matter how marginal, no matter how sort of transgressive, no matter how opaque or occult it might be. You don't have to work too hard to find it anymore, by virtue of, the interface that we're dealing with now, computers and whatnot. So I think there is something lost for younger people right now, is the thrill of discovery and the thrill, the sort of the archaeology of, of finding, signs of life out there, or like-minded kids that way. So there's a bit of that loss. The other thing is, I didn't deal with the film because it's too rich. Is I was thinking about this as I was editing it. I talked to one fellow about it, Steve Shaw, when we were interviewing. But is Detroit reached a point now with its sort of post-bankruptcy and sort of, gentrification is a word that gets thrown around, but the fact that with its stability, is Detroit now, from a cultural standpoint, in a post-historical place where history is no longer going to be written in Detroit, cultural history, because now everything has been sort of, everything is controlled, sort of managed, curated, orchestrated. I mean, that's the whole thing. Is there anything that's going to start in the neighborhoods and grow big out of Detroit anymore? Or are we already now immediately in a global play? I mean, that's the whole thing with the film, kind of points to that. It's hard to do anything kind of in the shadows anymore because, and I'm wondering if Detroit as a city, does it have any of that sort of spontaneous history ahead of itself? Cultural history, musical history.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really fascinating. And I think about it in reference to your coverage of Detroit, obviously, in Midwest hardcore. And, like jazz that came before it, or R&B, or, all kinds of music. There were regional varietals. There was, what was happening in Southern California sounded different than what was going on in DC that sounded different from here. And I think in some ways, maybe what the internet has allowed us to do is to access things, but it's also kind of flattened things out where there's not that regionalism, I think, anymore.
It's destroyed the whole sort of notion. I don't mean of neighborhood as a sort of a tangible space, but the whole notion of enclaves. The borders are so not amorphous, but I mean, they're so sort of, there's no sort of, it's almost like there's no isolation anymore. That's the problem. And I think what it is that, when things are done in isolation, then they kind of flourish on their own terms and they develop their own, syntax, musical, I'm sure it happened with hip hop too. They were all started in the neighborhoods, on the street corners. They developed a style. Eventually, this style sort of became noticed, and then once it was noticed, it's just. But the question I had is in Detroit as a city, is it possible to be invisible anymore? Is it possible by virtue of many things, by virtue of technology, by virtue of the fact that the city is now stabilized, is no longer a city in flux. Everything is sort of secured. It seems a lot more. And that's one of the things we never dealt with in the film. And it was just one of the last few sort of examples of, okay, when things aren't secured, wonderful little things can happen outside of the oversight. And that's the one thing I find interesting. And in the corridor too, look at the corridor now. I mean, I'm sure there's still pockets of the corridor where we're dealing with poverty and sort of, risk and criminal elements and whatnot. But it's less and less. Yeah. And what do you lose? What do you gain with security? The question is, what do you lose when you gain with security and sort of order?
Yeah.
So that's something we never dealt with in a film. That's another 90 minutes. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't want to throw something on people's reading list, but if they're interested in this era in which you cover, there's a great crime book, actually, that talks about the Cass Corridor. It's called Masquerade, and it's about a love triangle gone bad, which actually the Necros, who later became Big Chief, used as the basis for the Mack Avenue Skull Game.
Oh, I see. Yeah, I didn't know that.
So that book is really fascinating. If you're interested in knowing kind of like how the police dealt with this and what was going on in this late 70s to early 80s period, it's a fascinating companion. I would recommend it to anybody. But talking about shaping it and finding all of these threads, there was a bit that, with any film, obviously you had to trim, right?
Yeah, there was parts. I mean, like I mentioned earlier, I spoke with almost 70 people. Originally, it was a 2-hour, 40-minute film. There were a lot of sort of tangents that were very juicy, but kind of it was just too long. It was too long, and in the process of bringing it down from like 2 hour, 40 minutes to an hour, just under 2 hours, not only did I lose some interviewees, but I also lost some side stories, like how Detroit was a big part of the whole Saturday Night Live performance by Fear. That John Belushi brought a bunch of kids in. Detroit brought a whole sort of posse of their own to that. And they were on national TV, causing problems on camera live for America to sort of shake their finger at. But Detroit was a big part of that. There were some personalities within the scene. A girl named Laura Lee, who was a very sort of kind of a interesting, very significant figure at that point in time. I remember her when I came in on the scene, but she's kind of started in the Freezer era. A black girl, you don't see many of those in the scene, but we lost that. There's also backstories from some of the people and how they found their way there, which I liked a lot, because there's just all these kids who, found their way down to the corridor through bookies, only because their high school guidance counselor saw that they were kind of like, marginal kids in their school, didn't have many friends, and they were kind of well beyond their peers. And so a teacher says, hey, maybe you should go see some of these bands that are playing down at bookies. And the one kid went down to bookies to see these bands, one of the bands that happened to be like the Necros. And then from there, he kind of followed them down to the corridor, and then he became part of that. Now so there's a lot of those sort of stories, like all the roads that took a lot of kids there. And there's some other things, a bit on Nunzio's, which is a club in Allen Park, which is a big part of the scene and all the chaos there, and amongst other things as well.
Yeah. So,
the film had to be tightened up, and I had to be very disciplined in terms of just dealing with a very small window. It effectively goes from the summer of 1981 to the summer of 1982.
The thing I find interesting when I look at various musical scenes in Detroit, obviously, is legacy. I mean, we can talk all day about Motown or Fortune Records or the Grandy Ballroom or bookies. One of the things I find fascinating about the Freezer scene is that, as you said, this hardcore scene was really quick. It was like within just a few years that a lot of these bands came together.
Not even a few years. Yeah. I mean, if you really want to look at it within the sort of the context of the film, it's like literally within 8 to 10 months.
Yeah.
And I think, but I'm going to let you finish your question, though, because there's something that was to add to it. But go ahead.
Sure. But just that legacy of it, I mean, it's amazing to me. I mean, you do talk to Corey in there and Tesco, obviously, who started Touch and Go. And I remember Tesco being on the panel with us over at Third Man, where he goes, we put these singles out and these EPs, and like the first one's worth more than my car. So, for example, the Negative Approach Linda Blair cover sold on a collector site for like $5,000 in the past year or so. Same with these other records. I mean, what is it when you think about the legacy of this scene? I mean, both from a musical standpoint, but also from an inspirational standpoint. What do you think?
Well, let's start with the inspirational standpoint. I think right now we all talk about, not we all, as part of our kind of lexicon now, DIY. A lot of people, almost everybody understands when you say DIY, it stands for do it yourself. And if anything, the American hardcore punk scene was probably one of the first scenes that really kind of made DIY visible as a means to get things done, only because there was no other way to do it unless you did it yourself. And by virtue of that, you invented it as you went along, as long as it served your needs. So I think that American hardcore scene shows that, you can only go as far and with the tools that you decide to sort of assemble and implement yourself. I mean, that's one thing, is the DIY spirit, that you can do things. And keep in mind, unlike these other scenes, you're talking about like the Grandy or even the Gold Dollar or even like bookies. Those are all licensed businesses, bars, clubs, on some operating with some level of legitimacy, if not total legitimacy. The Freezer Theater was none of that. It was not a legitimate venue. It was not a bar. It was not a rental hall. It was not a sort of a in any respects on the map. So that's one thing that's fascinating, the fact that they took this horde of all these kids, these white suburban, mostly males from the suburbs and from better upbringings, to come down to a comparatively lousy neighborhood, dangerous neighborhood compared to where they're coming from, to actually find themselves, find one another, and to flourish. These kids were just kids, a lot of clamor, a lot of noise. It looked violent, but it wasn't. It was physical. But, they kind of did it and they moved on. And what happened was, like when I started to go see shows in 1985 in Detroit, at that point in time, it was an iteration and probably a second or third rollover version of what had come at that point in time. Keep in mind, the 1981-82 Detroit hardcore punk scene was not precedented by much, certainly not in Detroit. The punk scene at Bookies was, if anything, it was a reaction to that. That's the level of inspiration it took from that. But it was pretty unprecedented, sort of in a big way. And I think what happens is that, for subsequent, waves of people who get involved with it, kids, eventually it becomes establishes itself as a form of music, as a genre. It establishes itself as a market. And, it leads us now to what's in present day is where, literally, hardcore punk, by virtue of all these sort of 30 plus years now, is just a form of music, a legitimate sort of subset of, pop music. And at the time, like Ian MacKay says in the film, for 10 years, major labels didn't even know what was happening under their nose until they saw this band called Nirvana. It says, hey, what are we going to do with this band? Even though that band was secretly a culmination of, everything, Neil Young, Black Flag, Minor Threat, Dead Kennedys, Husker Du. And then what happened is then it just becomes part of the popular lexicon. And I think the film deals with a bit of that. I don't want to get too involved with that in the film. I just want to tie it to like something like what Dave Buick did with Italy Records, putting out some important singles early on, because he was a fanboy and he's an acolyte of what Touch and Go was doing and what Discord were doing. So there is that resonance there that if you look for it, it does exist, and we can't take it for granted. I think the irony is one thing, just the last point about that is that does it need to be recognized as a legitimate, chapter in the history of Detroit rock and roll? I mean, there's a lot of sacred cows in Detroit rock and roll that you always talk about, that you always name drop. And certainly this one is never mentioned. It's not even footnoted. And, why? Because the music was, raw, no pretense or polish, but still authentic, not palatable, but you kind of learn to like it. You do learn to like it because some days you feel that way. Right. And so that's one thing I think, if anything, should be the argument, like, hey, why isn't this recognized between, whatever's happening, between electronic music and Bob Seger? Yeah. Right. Why isn't it sort of in there?
I've said this. Yeah, I've said this many times about here. We need someone with a funny accent from somewhere else to tell us it has value. Like if you look at,
do I have a funny accent? I can say roof for a boat.
Hey, White Stripes, it was John Peel, as you were talking about the techno guys, it's Europe that loved them. Yeah, I mean, it was, there's a lot of people who were around during the Grandy scene, but there were people like my dad who's like, I don't understand this Iggy and the Stooges thing. And then you've got the Ramones and the guys in the UK going, oh, that stuff's great. So we had to go back and relook at some of that stuff. So maybe we've been built on this sort of egalitarianism in this town where it's like, we're all in the same boat together. So nobody's better than anyone else. So therefore that guy, him and his band. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I like it, but I'm not going to lose my mind over it like these guys somewhere else do.
And I think, what's behind that, who knows? Was there resentment of people who succeed? But I think the one thing is back to what you're saying about how it takes an external sort of assessment to really sort of remind you of what you have. I think that's true. It's also, with a lot of those other examples that you mentioned, like, even the Stooges and the MC5, I mean, they were still major label bands. They were still a part of a sort of, musical sort of marketplace, right? And let's not sort of forget that. And I think the one thing is why the Detroit hardcore scene doesn't really sort of register for most people is, okay, they didn't put a lot of records because it ended almost as quickly as it started, number one. Number two, there was no money to be made from them. There's no exploitation to be had. I mean, really, if you were playing their records on a radio show, you were doing it because you love their music and the 15 people who listen to your radio show love the music, but there were no ads sort of, being bought for that sort of, sort of musical sort of context, genre, whatever. So I think that's one thing, you couldn't milk it. And you couldn't, and that's what, like back to what Ian said in the film, Ian Mackay, he says, until the major labels realized, hey, there's a market here that we can just sort of buff it, give it a little luster and shine and a bit of image, and we could sort of do things with this. And they did. And that's, it happened. I mean, that's the way it is. That's why I think, if what you're saying, a lot of these other bands, I mean, these in Detroit, all these things, all these forms, even something like, you talk about the garage rock, you talk about Bob Seger, you talk about Funkadelic, this and that, they were all part of a musical establishment. This is not. This is sort of counter establishment or outside of the establishment.
Yeah.
The establishment puts constrictions and restraints on you. So then maybe that's why.
Yeah. Well, talking about selling music, I hear that there's a soundtrack possibly on the way. Can you explain this?
I think what it is, I've been working with Dave and Roe on this almost not since day one, but since once the project started taking form, and I think they were on board to do something. Things got rolling up until our April premiere got delayed or deferred because of the pandemic, and then they kind of, I don't know what happened, if they've been sitting on their hands since then, or if they've got other concerns or other pressing. But I think they're back. They picked up the ball again. And what it is, it's about doing not just the music. It's not about the music, but I think it's all about the packaging. And I think they want to kind of duplicate and replicate the look and the feel of that era, the sort of handmade sort of element of it. And I think they just need to be badgered and to be told that and reminded that, hey, there's people waiting on this. Because I think it's a great thing. I mean, if they're going to pull it off, and they will pull it off, it's just a matter of hopefully they get it out there sooner than later. So. It's in the works, I believe. I can take a walk like a block over and knock on their door and shame them into action. Shame them into action. But I think that's on the docket. I believe it is. And so, but you want to talk to them to get the things, because it is. I'm not really directly involved with it. I'm sort of connected to it. So there's something, I'm not going to say you heard it here first, but there's so much material I have. I'm thinking that possibly I might want to adapt this into a picture book form. For maybe late next summer, next fall. But that's something that at this point in time, I just need to assess and gauge how well the film does in terms of before even considering that. Sounds good. It's like asking me to run another marathon after I just finished running a marathon with this thing. So it's just like, I understand. I always feel bad asking what's next, because a filmmaker is like, no, I'm talking to you about what I just did. Stop trying to get me to do something that'll take another 5 years of my life. Thank you. Yeah. I think one thing is, we'll see what happens. We'll see what happens, I think, in that respect. But let's sort of enjoy it now at this point in time, for sure, while we're locked in for the next few months still. Are there good places online, speaking of, since that's what we're talking through right now, that people can go to and stay up to date or learn more about the project? Well, I think what it is that there's always the website, which I keep up to date, www.detroithardcoremovie.com. I'm not a fan of social media, but I've been sort of persuaded to do an Instagram feed, which I'm doing, which is turning out to maybe be a good idea, because there's a lot of materials that aren't in the film that's fun to share with people. Outtakes, humorous things, little sort of odd, rare artifacts, pictures, flyers, snippets, this and that. So at this point in time, I think everybody's probably seen the film, because you can't skip to this discussion, right? But right. I think when you talk about this, when you recommend it to people, I think it's important. I'm not doing this from a standpoint of I'm trying to sell more tickets, but I specifically did not want to make a film that was so narrow in its appeal, in terms of where you have to even know about. I mean, you don't even have to like hardcore punk or punk rock music to enjoy this film. That's something I really wanted to sort of, put into it. I wanted to put, on some level, let it succeed as a story about just, community, ambition, youthful enthusiasm, constructive enthusiasm from a kind of a group of kids you would never really associate with being sort of, can-do and positive and proactive. I mean, granted, it's hard to reconcile that with these pictures that you see in the film or the music. It seems anything but constructive and uplifting and inspiring. But on some level, I wanted to make a feel-good movie. And I'm not kidding, a feel-good movie where you watch this and you kind of are sort of touched by, and you get to meet people that you would never probably have a chance to talk to or listen to in your walk of life, usually. And some of these people now are lawyers. Some of these people now are psychologists. Some of them now are educators. Some of them now are grandparents. And this is a small part of their life which might not seem to matter much to most people, but when you see it, it kind of should matter to everybody, because you see what what kind of happened, while we weren't looking, and how kind of resonant it might be on just a human level. And I think in the film, I wanted to bring a bit of that into it, right? And so hopefully I succeeded. We'll see.
That's fantastic. And like I said, I don't think it matters what era we're talking about. I was joking about the ancient Greeks going, oh, these kids today, to parents going, oh, these kids today. Thousands of years, it's always been these kids today. But remember, those kids grow up to be the educators and the psychologists. And
exactly. And they leave a bit behind, with their sort of pupils and students and children. So I think that's part of it I want to bring into it. There is something, profoundly positive with this whole thing that we're talking about and watching. And I think it's there if you really want to find it.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you, Paula. Tell everybody to see this film, right? Because I think it's something I want to support Cinema Detroit. Because Cinema Detroit supports me, and this, if we do this now, we can do it again if we can pull it off. So thank you again too as well.
Fantastic. And before I let you go, I just want to let everyone know, as Otto says, a great way to support, tell people about this film, buy tickets for your friends, or you can donate at cinemadetroit.com. We are a nonprofit, unlike most movie theaters, because it allows us to do the things like we're doing right now during the pandemic, and to be able to continue, so that hopefully someday soon we'll all get together and be able to enjoy, fresh popcorn and all the lovely amenities of a theater once again.
Yeah. Very important.
Yep.
Okay, nice to talk to you, Rob. Take care.
Cheers.
Okay. Yeah, bye.